Welcome to Looking Back, Moving Forward. But before I begin, I want to mention in preparing this presentation, I was met with three challenges. The first, like many children of Holocaust survivors, I walked a fine line between asking too little or too much about their experiences. If I asked too much, I ran the risk of reviving their horrors and subsequent nightmares. But now they are gone. I wish I ran the risk of asking more. Because I did not, there are gaps in their testimonies that I have filled with context, facts, and inferences that have strong circumstantial evidence. Another challenge I was faced was how much or how little to share about their horrific experiences. Too little, and I run the risk of overly sanitizing the inhumanity, but too much, and the story gets lost in the horrifying details, or worse, I could inadvertently encourage some kind of Holocaust pornography, so to speak. I tried to take the middle road to illustrate the extent of inhumanity that can occur under certain circumstances. That being said, I remind people this presentation is not appropriate for a young audience. And finally, my last challenge was to narrow down years of research, information, and reflection into a relatively short presentation. And as a result, I decided to present only one of my parents' experiences today. Still, the full depth of even one of my parents' experiences cannot be fully appreciated in the time frame I have. My concluding remarks will include moving forward, a brief personal introspection for my grandchildren and a future generation, which you might find thought-provoking. On April 16th, 1945, British troops advanced toward Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Years of war did not prepare the soldiers for what they were about to experience. As they approached the camp, a decaying stench filled their noses. Yet still, the stench betrayed the enormity of inhumanity just beyond the gates. Thousands of emaciated dead bodies littered the ground. But this was not just a graveyard. The barracks also contained 60,000 barely living inmates afflicted with typhus, lice, hunger, and abuse. Many were merely sitting in a stupor or lying immobilized on barrack bunks. And as soldiers worked their way through the horror in the barrack buildings, they may have noticed a 17-and-a-half-year-old girl, or perhaps they may have dismissed her as dead. She was semi-unconscious, unable to speak, severely dehydrated, emaciated, and barely hanging onto life. Days before, she heard military planes flying over the camp and had only one wish, that a bomb would drop on her barrack and end her immense suffering. That 17-and-a-half-year-old girl was my mother, Bella. In 1939, Poland had the largest Jewish population in Europe and the second largest in the world. But by 1945, approximately 3 million Polish Jews perished. Bella was one of the last remaining Jews of pre-war Poland. She was a remnant of a 1,000-year-old culture that had contributed to not only Jewish history in Poland, but also to achievements that impacted societies around the world. That culture and history was annihilated in 6 historically short years. Bella bore witness to one of the greatest acts of inhumanity up to that point in modern history. Those acts of inhumanity included babies, toddlers, pregnant women, older adults, frail, and the mentally ill. The inhumanity targeted every Jew, was non-discriminating, and made no exceptions. As I grew older, questions haunted me about how and why this level of inhumanity could happen. Specifically, how could people perpetuate such evil, whether they were physically carrying out the violence or simply doing the administrative work of the party or a nation? I have often heard that the Holocaust was largely carried out by psychopaths or sociopaths, but this idea never resonated with me. The massive devastation seemed only possible with the willingness of a large number of individuals, which meant that many of those who carry out the atrocities led seemingly normal lives. The uncomfortable yet perplexing realization was that ordinary people like you and me, who otherwise led relatively ethical lives, had the potential to morally disengage and implement such enormous evil and then return to relatively normal lives again. Take, for example, Franz Ziris, a commandant of a concentration camp who considered himself a good and loving man who ate Sunday evening dinners with an adored wife and a young son. Then, the next day, he ordered and oversaw the execution of thousands of people, including children like his own child. I found that I could answer some of my lingering questions by understanding how people could develop and sustain this moral contradiction within the context of my parents' experiences. And to do so, I had to start by looking at the world Bella was born into. If one walks the cobblestone streets of the old town and views the remnants of its architectural past, it becomes apparent that Pietrka Trybunalski is one of the oldest towns in Poland. And the time that Bella was born and raised in the Polish community, the Jewish presence dated back 700 years or near the 13th century. Before 1939, the Jews of Piotrków had a vibrant cultural, political, and social environment, much like its bigger cities of Warsaw and Lodz. This vibrancy is illustrated by the diversity of Jewish secular and religious thought practices, such as the Jewish Socialist Labor Party on the left and the religious Zionists on the right. The Jewish population of this medium-sized town constituted approximately 13 to 15,000 residents, or 20% of the general population. But the community established a unique distinction as the center of Hebrew publishing in all of Europe. It attracted and produced some very distinguished European rabbis and religious scholars who were well recognized in the writing of legal Jewish texts. Among those notable rabbis was the last chief rabbi of Piotrków, Moshe Chaim Lau. He was principally designated as the religious leader of the Orthodox community, but was also considered symbolically as a leading distinguished voice of all the Jews of Piotrków. He, along with Bella's father, played significant roles in attempting to maintain and save the Jews in the ghetto. He was known for refusing to abandon the Jewish community after the occupation and was often famously quoted as saying, "Better a living death than a dead life." Growing up, Bella stated her father had a vital role in the community, but I never understood his connection to important religious leaders until his own research led me to find references to Bella's father and his connections in historical documents. Her father, as I found out, was remembered as a leading activist representing many Orthodox groups associated with the Agudah Yisrael movement. And as a leader in his community, he spoke multiple languages proficiently and had a strong understanding of world affairs, and was often sought after by extended family and community members for his insights. He was a member of the Kihila, or the Jewish Council in Piotrków, and later, because of his role in the community, was forced to serve on the Nazi-occupied Judenrat. Besides her father, Bella's family was composed of an older brother, an older sister, and mother. And in her testimonials, Bella described her home as strictly religiously observant, but very warm. She spoke of a longing and a fondness for the comfort of the regularity of Shabbos, or the Jewish Sabbath, and Jewish holidays. Like most other owners of small shops that dominated the Piotrków economy, Bella's father and mother eked out a living running a modest wholesale leather supply shop and lived either a poor or a lower middle class existence. But irrespective of their economic situation, and as a result of her parents' personal values and religious obligations, Bella always remembered her father and mother's kindness to others. She remembered her mother preparing food for people outside her immediate family. She remembered her father each week before going home, finding a different indigent or homeless individual to share the Friday night meal. She would say that there was always an extra empty chair at the dining room table for the stranger who was poor and could not share the beginning of Shabbos, or the Jewish Sabbath. We do not have pictures of Bella or her older brother before and during the Holocaust. The middle image is her older sister at an age that would have been close to what Bella might have looked like in 1939. So how am I to understand the impending inhumanity that Bella is about to experience? Her less obvious history she was born into provided me context in understanding how ordinary citizens committed such atrocities against her. At the moment of her birth on July 25th, 1927, Bella inherited a crime of deicide, meaning she inherited 2,000 years of cultural norms of hate and prejudice that stemmed from religious doctrine and accused the Jewish people for the death of God. She immediately assumed this well-documented history of anti-Semitism by European society that over many centuries resulted in continually evolving stereotypes, persecutions, mass killings, and expulsions. Bella also inherited the cultural biases expressed by the established scientific and pseudoscientific disciplines of her day, such as social Darwinism and eugenics. These disciplines asserted that Bella, as a Jew, was racially and socially inferior at birth, and by her very existence limited the advancement of human civilization. This viewpoint infiltrated society at large at the time. In the years leading up to the Holocaust, the Nazi Party and other political influences used already existing prejudices that stem from both religious doctrine and the pseudo-scientific community to portray the Jews as less than human, a term coined by Dr. David Smith in his 2011 book of the same name. It stands to reason that once Bella was perceived as less than human, she was no longer relatable as a fellow human being. Once she was no longer relatable as a fellow human being, treating her as inhuman became possible and perhaps no longer seemed morally unethical. Once she was depersonalized, she had little value. She was no longer a unique individual with a family, a historical context, or capable of suffering. Suddenly, complicit citizens could see no material or moral comparison between Bella and their own lives. This was how a citizen like Commandant Franz Ziris could rationalize his daily work at Mauthausen concentration camp during the day and restfully sleep at night. But why then? If the prejudice had been around for thousands of years, what events converged in the early 20th century that opened the door for Bella to be the culprit of society ills and eventual victim? First was the rise of secular scientific prejudices melded with the long-standing religious anti-Semitism at this time. Second, the resiliency of prejudices against the Jewish people over centuries of intergenerational transmission made and continue to make anti-Semitism uniquely ripe for exploitation. As my father would say, hate for the Jews was fed from the milk of the mother's breast. Third, when a world depression triggered economic insecurity, citizens demanded a reason and a simple solution for their suffering. Given the centuries of prejudice, it is easy to see how condemning the Jews for the economic world order was not a far-flung scapegoat. So the stage was set for Bella. By 1939, Bella was depersonalized through centuries of prejudice, was less than human, had no moral or material equivalency, and was responsible for disrupting the economic world order. And as irrational and contradictory as it may sound to us now, Bella was viewed by the greater society as both subhuman and also somehow able to control forces that disrupted a so-called economic world order. On the eve of the German invasion of Poland, inhumanity was about to play out, and Bella and the Polish Jews were center stage. On September 1st, 1939, the Nazi invasion of Poland began. Bella and her family most assuredly would not have escaped the thundering, distant noise of the early morning Nazi aerial bombardments that pounded Poland's western border. As the hours passed and days passed, the noises became more pronounced. It quickly became very clear that this invasion was an overwhelming force that could not be stopped. Panic set in everywhere in Piotrków. People streamed out of Piotrków, many heading southeast to smaller towns. The routes east were clogged with people walking or traveling by wagons, horses, horse carriages, or pushcarts. My grandparents deliberated very quickly whether to stay or flee. In addition to his concern about protecting his family and escaping the imminent war, Bella's father must have been cognizant of his leadership position in the community. If he stayed, he, along with his family, would especially be targeted for violence and death. And in her testimonial, my mother stated that decisions were made very quickly. They attained a horse and a wagon and fled to a village called Sulyov, 8.5 miles away, eventually hoping to get beyond the Russian border. After stopping at Sulyov, on the afternoon of September 4th, Bella and her mother rested outside of a building, while the other families were temporarily elsewhere. Before Bella and her mother could respond to the sound of overhead planes, a bomb landed near where they were sitting. Both were knocked to the ground, and a piece of dispersed shrapnel from an incendiary bomb ignited her mother's hair. So here was this 12-and-a-half-year-old girl facing a mother with hair on fire, while crying in a state of shock and with nowhere to turn for help. Bella found the clarity to use a cloth of some kind to extinguish the flames surrounding her mother's hair and prevent the flames from reaching her mother's face. And as days went on and night fell, the German bombing and fighter planes ceased for a period of time. After lying on the ground for a number of hours in shock, Bella helped her traumatized mother up, and they started to navigate through what remained of the town, now only lit by burning buildings and flames. Bella recalled passing people either walking or kneeling as they continuously yelled and screamed out for their loved ones. She witnessed a man and his horse burning alive in his wagon with no one to help. And as they walked, her mother told Bella to avoid stepping on human limbs scattered along the streets. Eventually, they found other family members and quickly moved to a nearby forest, where they spent the night lying on the forest floor in shock. 1,000 people were killed in a small town alone during this bombing. The next morning, recognized that it was futile to outrun the overwhelming force, Bella's family decided to return to their apartment in Piotrków. As they were returning at 4 p.m. on the 5th of September, the Germans entered and occupied the town of Piotrków. During the next week, many Jews were psychologically immobilized by the recent shocking events. During the first 2 days of the occupation, the Germans murdered dozens of the city Jews. The Germans set fire to a large portion of the Jewish quarter. And as Jews ran out of burning buildings, they were often shot to death. As the days went by, German forces established restrictive orders, such as curfews. And to add to the shock and paralysis, Nazis and their collaborators sporadically kidnapped and violently forced Jews to do labor. Orders allowed Germans to pilfer from Jewish business for their personal gain or for the benefit of German industries. And as the brutal actions continued, it became clear that local Polish collaborators willingly pinpointed Jewish-owned stores and warehouses to aid the Nazis. And based on historical record, it's likely that Bella's family lost any commodities they had in their store, or the store was taken over by a German manager. Sale of food to Jews were forbidden, even by Jewish-owned businesses. Eventually, all food distribution to Jews in Piotrków were dictated by the occupying forces and their collaborators. Bella remembered a period of time when Germans forced themselves into the apartments and looted. When they entered her family's apartment, she remembered Nazis yelling, clubbing her father and brother, and roughly throwing them against a wall while taking anything of material value. On October 8th, a Nazi proclamation announced that the first ghetto ever in Poland would be established, and all Jews were commanded to move in this area. People 12 years and older were recognized to wear blue and white Star of David armbands. This directive identified Bella's inferior position within the greater Polish society, making her a target for potential exploitation by the occupying force and their local collaborators. 2 days after this proclamation, 12 members of the local Jewish community were forced to serve on the Judenrat, to administer the ghetto under direct orders of Nazis. Bella's father was one of these 12 members. For the Judenrat, more often than not, their decision to collaborate or not with the Nazis was a catch-22 between life and death. It took all of their past leadership skills to maintain the community and prevent as many Jews as possible from being killed. And in November of 1939, the destruction of the Great Synagogue began. The Torah scrolls and any item of religious significance was desecrated. The building's beautiful, iconic interior was used as lavatories and a holding place for Jews or Poles before going to slave labor or for execution. And to further demoralize the population, Jewish men could be seen cleaning streets, lavatories, and even the interior of the synagogue floor using men's prayer shawls. Portions of Jewish cemeteries were destroyed, and the tombstones were eventually used as paving material for roads and sidewalks. And as cold winter set in, wood for heating became scarce, hunger was prevalent, and because of a lack of access to food. The Nazis intended to hoard resources and limit the availability to Jews. During this period, physicians were hampered with ever-decreasing medical supplies. Additionally, the Judenrat was ordered to draft 1,000 men from ages 14 to 60 to be used for labor camps. And in the remaining weeks of 1939, Bella was confined to her home. In the beginning of 1940, the remaining Jews were forcibly moved into the ghetto. Bella and her family were squeezed into a much smaller living space that were close to the location where the Jewish leadership was centralized. To further exacerbate the poor living conditions, the Nazis instituted a resettlement policy which migrated Jews from old towns and cities to Pietrków. Bella recalled that during this period, another family of 3 moved into their family's already exceedingly cramped living space and slept on the tiny kitchen floor. One historian characterized the living conditions as chickens living in a chicken coop. The ghetto held 182 houses and apartment buildings, comprising 4,178 rooms, which averaged 4 to 8 people per room. Bella's family's living space now included 8 adults and 2 children. Bella's father continued to have a role in the Judenrat, which was responsible for distributing the extremely limited Nazi-approved resources. As the year progressed, deaths began to surge, and as a result of hunger and epidemics, by the last month of 1940, an outbreak of typhus occurred. As resident of the Warsaw Ghetto, Chaim Kaplan wrote a diary describing the ghetto experience that succinctly captured the overriding atmosphere that Bella, her family, and her community also faced within the occupation. He described horrors that would follow her until 1945. Just as Kaplan described about his experience, Bella also had no avenue to protect herself during this period and/or no opportunity of escape or to defend herself. The first terror Bella faced every day was the threat of being shot at any time. If she made an error of judgment, made a mistake, or simply inadvertently drew attention to herself and in any way, she could be beaten or shot without warning. And because she was considered inhuman by her persecutors, she was not worthy of the opportunity to explain or justify her actions in any way. Kaplan coined the term bending or pointing of a finger, which meant that the Nazis and their collaborators were always turning the blame to their closest Jew. In fact, in this atmosphere, Kaplan described that simply existing was reason enough to provoke perpetrators. Each day, Bella endured the anxiety of leaving her residence, knowing that a brutal and heartless beating could occur. As if the threat of harm wasn't enough, the third terror was the anxiety of constant humiliation, which often accompanied the physical violence. Additionally, research suggests that over the course of the war, Bella's daily environment likely included tortured human voices and laughter of sadistic oppressors. By the beginning of 1941, sanitary conditions in Pietrków ghetto worsened. Partially equipped sewage and drainage systems led to epidemics like tuberculosis and typhus, which took 1,000 lives alone. Bella avoided contracting these illnesses, and the following series of unexpected events placed her within the realm of survival. Between 1940 to 1941, Bella matured significantly, and her physical growth spurt turned her into a tall and lanky 14-year-old. She appeared to be 2 years older than her age. The youngest children who were unable to work were most likely being put to death. However, thousands of strong teenagers or young adults were needed for slave labor jobs in factories that supported the Nazi war effort. Appearing older and able to work gave her an advantage for survival. Knowing this, she or her father intentionally disguised her true birth age by 2 years. The evidence of this disguise will be noted shortly. The second unexpected event occurred in July when a portion of the Judenrat was arrested and accused of an underground conspiracy. Bella's father was not arrested and was reassigned to a role that allowed him to influence the food distribution in the ghetto. Because of his role, there is a strong likelihood he may have been able to influence the distribution of work permits for his family. And finally, rumors of increased mass killings in eastern Poland filtered back to Piotrków. I suspect that my grandfather understood the gravity of this news and the possible fate of his community. He must have realized that any chance of survival for his children would revolve around their ability to work in slave labor to support the German army. Disguised as a 16-year-old and with a special work permit, Bella was initially assigned to slave labor in Piotrków. Her first forced task was to search for valuables in mounds of clothes left from Jews who were killed. Most historians agree the Nazis formulated a more systematic and efficient method for killing Jews, known as the final solution, as the Wannsee Conference in 1942. This decision impacted the fate of Bella's family because it led to the deportation of all non-essential Jews from Piotrków. In 1942, the world Bella previously knew was barely surviving. In fact, her community was imploding into inhumane oblivion. In March of that year, the open ghetto officially closed and was sealed with barbed wire. Only escorted Jewish workers deemed useful by the Nazis were allowed in and out of the ghetto. Non-Jews were not allowed in, and any business of any kind was now forbidden. Spontaneous arrests and executions of Jews continued to increase. Some were killed on the streets, some were killed in now destroyed interior of the Great Synagogue, some were gassed in vehicles, and some shot and dumped in mass graves in the neighboring Rakov forest. At this time, Chief Rabbi Lau reconvened the pre-war council in the study, including Bella's father, to share the distressing testimonials of two men who escaped from a labor detail in the Chelmno forest. Their assignment was to dig mass graves, and they had rumors of entire ghettos being evacuated to Treblinka. This was their first evidence of systematic annihilation of entire communities. While many denied this fate, Bella's father accepted the reality of the situation. Bella recalled her father bringing together the immediate and extended family members to deliver his assessment of what would follow in the coming months. Bella would never forget the weeping throughout the room when he concluded with his last words, "We will be sacrificed for all of Israel." On April 1st, the boundaries of the ghetto were narrowed even further into a small geographic area. The overcrowding conditions worsened. And by September of 1942, the Nazis began preparation for the action, which was essentially a code word for mass deportation. The Nazis forced more people in the ghetto from neighboring villages, further ballooning the population. And during this period, the Jewish Council again convened to discuss organized resistance. Council members disagreed, and Bella's father argued against resistance, fearing that it could massacre those who might have a chance to survive. On the eve of October 13th, the SS and the Ukrainian auxiliary forces surrounded the ghetto boundaries. The next day, the deportations began. A quota of 6,000 Jewish men, women, and children were rounded up in the central square to be transported into 52 cattle cars. They were first searched for any valuables and then marched to the cattle cars at the train depot. Those who were too old or frail and were unable to march were shot on the spot. Similarly, any Jew attempting to hide or evade roundup were shot on the spot as well. And for this deportation and the next two successive deportations, each of the 6,000 person quotas were met with the members of the general ghetto population. On a rain-filled day, October 25th, Bella came to her ghetto residence from her day of labor to find her parents gone. She began crying and begged her older siblings to be reunited with her parents. Her guiding figures and symbols of constancy in a very insecure world were now gone. Because the SS could not meet the 6,000 person quota for this last roundup, they turned to Jewish leaders in the community who were not directly contributing to the war effort: scholars, teachers, doctors, lawyers, and a portion of the Judenrat. Bella's parents, along with the chief rabbi Lau, were now on this last transport. My grandparents were two of the 24,000 Jews that were sent to the Treblinka gas chambers. Their ashes, along with approximately 925,000 other Treblinka victims, were spread throughout Poland and Europe. Bella, her older brother and sister, were now part of the remaining 2,400 to 3,000 Jews in Piotrków who were working in factories necessary for the war effort or who were still hidden. Although there were still a few thousand Jews remaining in ghetto, at that point, the Nazis declared Piotrków as Juden-free, or cleansed of Jews. So why didn't they resist? The evidence that my grandfather chose not to support active resistance has troubled me. My first instinct is that I would have thought better to fight and die than to surrender to one's death. But this courageous instinct is easy when sitting in a comfortable chair safely in my home. First of all, resistance wasn't absent. There were certainly many instances of passive resistance to the ghetto leading up to the deportations of 42. There was also several planned armed resistance attempts by secular Jewish activist groups within the ghetto that were foiled by the SS. And additionally, the Nazis meticulously created a fine-tuned atmosphere in the ghetto that intentionally demoralized the Jews and made resisting incredibly difficult. First, the SS created a continual state of siege with constant searches, plundering, and the 3 daily terrors I described earlier. Second, they created an atmosphere of collective guilt and interconnectedness, so that if an activist or a Judenrat leader attempted resistance, he or she risked the murder of a large portions of the community. And finally, when the ghetto was sealed, the Jews were literally isolated from the outside world and had little or no access to arms. The long-standing anti-Semitic views held by the surrounding non-Jewish community made it difficult for those within the ghetto to determine with whom they could coordinate resistance without hostile repercussion. Yes, other ghettos throughout Poland were able to resist and had some relative success in their martyrdom. But Piotrkow's circumstances and the overwhelming force destined the smaller community and many others to annihilation with little option. At the end of 1942 and the beginning of 1943, under a new Nazi order, the remaining Jews in Piotrków and neighboring occupied territories were to be progressively taken to labor and concentration camps. When Bella's older brother learned that she was selected for transfer to a labor camp outside of Piotrków, he knew this was an extermination sentence. He and other surviving siblings frantically tried to find a way to protect their little sister. Their idea was to loosen floorboards below a large, heavy dresser and prepare to hide Bella under the floor at any moment, which is what they did. And on the day the authorities arrived, the family members feigned ignorance of her whereabouts. When the authorities left, Bella remembers her distressed brother helping her out from under the dresser. She was shocked and horrified to learn that in reprisal for not meeting their quota, the authorities took her sister and sister-in-law to a Section C factory supporting the Nazi war effort in Piotrków. Section C was considered to have horrific working conditions, exposing forced laborers to chemicals which were used in the manufacturing of nerve gas during World War I. Continual exposure turned human skin yellow and destroyed their internal organs. Bella would never see her sister and sister-in-law again. From January to July, the small ghetto where Bella and her brother lived looked like a ghost town. Most of the buildings and streets were nearly deserted, with open doors and broken windows flapping in the wind. There was little noise other than Nazis and collaborators roaming mostly empty residences, trying to find hidden Jews or looking for valuables. In July of 1943, the small ghetto was eliminated. Bella was separated from her older brother when he was assigned to the Bagai wood factory. 36 young women in Piotrków were placed in a 4-story barrack-like housing unit surrounded by barbed wire fence near the Hortensia glass factory. She was assigned to a group of 12 girls to work in the factory. Bella was the youngest of her group. The other approximately 1,500 remaining Jews in the ghetto were sent to other labor and concentration camps outside of Piotrków. At Hortensia, Bella faced a new set of existential risk. When she first set foot on the large factory floor, she was surrounded by large dome furnaces with arched openings that exposed workers to flames, hot molten glass, chemical fumes, and oppressive heat with no protection for their bodies. Bella's assignment was to work next to the arched openings and remove the molten glass from the furnace into a container. She remembers the containers, and the glass would break, burning her feet and legs, and in one case, cutting her leg down to the bone. But the environmental hazards were only part of the threatening working conditions at the factory. The Jewish laborers were treated as expendable commodities, like the materials they were hauling. German foremen brandished and used whips and rubber batons. Additionally, non-Jewish Polish skilled workers oversaw the slave laborers and were known to unexpectedly throw hot equipment at anyone they felt wasn't working hard enough or simply out of their hate for the Jews. The heat from the furnaces alone, especially in the summer, combined with shifts that were routinely 12 hours or longer, required enormous fortitude to survive. And so, for the next year and a half, Bella and the older girls struggled each day against the cruelty of unpredictable demands, extreme conditions, humiliation, and beatings. Never mind that they had to scrounge for enough food to satisfy their hunger and sustain the inhumane effort they exerted. During their time at Hortensia, Bella learned that her brother and sister and sister-in-law were taken to the Raqqa forest, forced to dig a mass grave, and then were shot. Bella was now confronted with the knowledge that her whole nuclear family was gone. She would forever have to respond to the world alone. Bella went into a state of shock, unwilling to speak and move from her bunk bed for some time. She could not resume her work and had lost her will to live. But her inability to work put her in immediate danger of extermination. The manager of Jewish labor at the factory, Solomon Gomberg, who was a former member of the Pietkov Judenrat, and beseeched Bella to get up and to continue to work so she could survive. And through this period, he probably sheltered her absence from work, while the other young women in her group provided her with some food. I have enough circumstantial evidence to conclude that Solomon Gomberg must have worked closely with Bella's father before the deportation and knew she was his daughter. I would later learn that Solomon Gomberg was recognized as an unsung hero after the war for exhibiting a great deal of courage in his attempts to save young Jews at great peril to himself. He, in all likelihood, saved Bella's life. Eventually, she did return to forced labor. In the beginning of 1944, Bella was 16 and a half years old and continued to labor at the factories. Meanwhile, Germany was losing battles while Allied forces from the West and the Soviets from the East successfully pushed into the interior of Europe. Needing to conserve a slave labor supply while simultaneously removing evidence of atrocities, the Nazis began to move any remnants of slave labor west. And on December 2nd, 1944, Bella was one of the last Jews transported out of Pietkov. 267 women and some children were forcefully crammed into cattle cars. And as the cattle car door closed and locked, the only light and air in this unusually cold, harsh winter came from the open spaces on the side panels. There was no food, no sanitary facilities. Bella remembered they were crammed like sardines, unable to sit and press directly against one another. They were crying and terrified of what would happen next. Only 162 of the 267 women survived that deportation. And as you can see on this list, Bella's birth date is indicated as 2 years older than her actual age. As Bella left Pietkov for the very last time, never to return, she left behind 60 nuclear and extended family members that perished during the 5-year period. Now that Bella and all the remaining Jews were deported, the complete annihilation of Jewish Pietkov was complete. Not only were 700 years of Jewish presence completely gone, the legacy of 700 years of Jewish culture and contributions nearly disappeared from the face of the earth as well. As the train moved northwest for several days, Bella spoke of the continuing suffering and crying within the cattle car. With little room to move at one point, Bella sensed a heavy weight leaning against her and realized the weight was a woman who has just died. Before long, another woman at her side passed away as well. Death surrounded her in the cattle car, and as she attempted to push the dead bodies away from her, she had already been exposed to death in the ghetto. But this was the first time she experienced the death of a person so close to her physical space. And as the train arrived at its intended destination, 50 miles north of Berlin, it slowed and stopped. Bella and those who were still alive likely heard the sounds of dogs barking, screaming voices of guards, and the cracks of whips. And as the doors opened, the guards forcibly evacuated prisoners within the cattle car. Bella stated that she, along with others, were beaten with batons or large sticks as they exited the cars. She remembered being ordered to stand in lines with hundreds of other women. The prisoners were marched through the gates of the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Bella was now entering a world where by the end of the war, approximately 92,000 to 114,000 women and children were shot or beaten to death, starved or gassed or died as a result of gruesome medical experiments. Bella was entering a world where she would experience the harshest labor and treatment in what Germaine Tillion, ethnologist and French survivor, called a place of slow extermination. Passing the entrance gates, the prisoners were continually beaten as they were taken to a building. Inside the building, they faced guards behind a row of tables on either side. Striped uniforms and wooden shoes or clogs were piled on one side of the table, and any form of a woman's modesty, young or old, was brutally violated. Bella was commanded to strip naked, and then her head and her entire body was completely shaven. Other survivors recalled how they were further humiliated when they saw male SS officers watching, jeering, and laughing during this process. It was apparent that the striped uniforms, clothing, and the wooden shoes may have come from victims who perished. And Bella stated that none of the garments or shoes fitted, and in some cases, no underwear was issued. Bella was showered and placed in barracks with prisoners of many nationalities and political dissidents. The space constraints were so limited that the 3 or more prisoners would be squeezed on one of the 3-tier bunks by laying opposite each other, as another survivor describes, forks and spoons. And by the end of 1944, Ravensbrück camp was severely crowded with prisoners and extremely limited food resources. Filth, disease, and hunger were at an indescribable scale, and Bella was surrounded with typhus, gangrene, frostbite, pneumonia, and exposed dead bodies. Many of the tortures at Ravensbrück were not just literal, but were also symbolic of a slow extermination process. In addition to notorious medical experiments and vicious female guards called the Angels of Death, nothing was more symbolic of a slow extermination than the appel or the roll call. Debilitating and exhausted prisoners were awakened by siren blares between 3 and 5 a.m. to announce the roll call. Women rushed out of the barracks to stand in rows of 5. If someone was not accounted for, Bella and others were required to stand rigid in 1944 sub-zero winter temperatures for hours. Any sign of weakness was met with beatings, with weapons, or even the guards' jackboots. If a prisoner appeared to be a useless mouth, meaning unproductive, they were shot or gassed and sent to the crematorium. Many prisoners could not withstand the temperatures, collapsed, and died. On one such appel in January, as women rushed out, Bella could not find her wooden clogs. It was common practice that either the last person to leave the barracks or those who simply had no energy to leave the bunks would be shot. Frantically, she kept looking as other Jewish inmates shouted for her to come out, come out. And Bella had no choice but to leave and stand in the snow with no shoes or lose her life. Others attempted to stabilize her as she stood on frigid feet during the roll call without drawing attention to the guards. During another roll call, Bella noticed that the rabbi's wife from Piotrkos was next to her and having difficulty standing. Bella tried to support the rabbi's weight, but was noticed by the guards and resulted in the first of her 3 severe beatings. one of which resulted in Bella losing most of her front teeth. Bella's labor assignment at Ravensbrück was to haul heavy loads of sand or bricks from a barge off the lake or from wagons to a storage facility. In a state of weakness from hunger, Bella stated she had to muster every bit of energy to work. She knew that if she would die if she became a useless mouth. She remembered using a wheelbarrow-shaped container without wheels that required 2 people to carry loads. And on one occasion, Bella was assigned to work with the rabbi's wife. Noticing that the rabbi's wife was weakening, Bella shifted the weight of the load to her own end and away from the rabbi's wife to relieve her load while still attempting to meet her quota. And because of this selfless act, Bella was beaten again. So in an environment where prisoners were simply trying to help themselves survive, Bella continued to try to help the rabbi's wife. One night, Bella found the rabbi's wife in a bunk alive but barely receptive. Bella knew she might be caught, but somehow was able to climb out of the barrack building and found a small can to fill with water. When Bella returned, she held the rabbi's wife's head in her arm and encouraged her to drink. But this woman from her hometown could not respond anymore. She died soon after. In the beginning of 1945, strategic losses mounted for the German army, and it became clear they were losing the war. Nevertheless, the SS and their collaborators continued torturing and killing prisoners until the very end. And in the last months of the war, Himmler, the architect of 15,000 labor camps, major death camps, and subcamps, launched a new extermination program for Ravensbrück, largely because of the prevalence of disease in the camp. Although not originally designed as a death camp, Ravensbrück predominantly used gassing and cremating of prisoners during the last months of the war. Himmler demanded 2,000 prisoners be exterminated a month, and Sarah Helm, in her book titled Ravensbrück, reported 50 prisoners were shot per day in front of the crematorium. Undoubtedly, hearing those daily shots, Bella and others must have been aware of the potential circumstances awaiting them. And it is in this environment, Bella and fellow prisoners were ordered into 2 long columns. It became apparent to Bella that the column she was standing in was headed for extermination. Fortuitously, a disturbance occurred in front of the columns, which drew barking dogs, capos, and SS attention away from where she was standing. Making a split-second decision, she quietly moved over to the other column, surely escaping death again. When the prisoners in her new column returned to the barrack, a non-Jewish prisoner threateningly confronted Bella with an anti-Semitic interrogation about why she did not stay in the first column. Even among the prisoners, under such dire circumstances, anti-Semitism still surfaced. Other Jewish prisoners joined Bella to surround the interrogator and threatened to kill her if she mentioned one word of Bella's move to the capos. At the end of January of 45 and the beginning of February, the Soviet army was approximately 400 miles away from Ravensbrück. And during that time alone, 2,200 prisoners were sent to the gas chambers. By mid-February, Bella and the other prisoners were grasping for any reservoir of strength to stay alive, let alone work. In the last part of March, a factory roof was hit when Ravensbrück was bombed for the first time. At this point, all 5,600 prisoners, including Bella, were evacuated by either death march or rail deportation. She, with some of the other prisoners, were again put in a cattle car with no water or food and transported to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Bella entered the Bergen-Belsen compound barely able to walk and extremely weak. It is unclear if she was cognizant of the abyss of inhumanity she entered. Another survivor stated that it was like walking into hell, with living skeletons shuffling past, rampant diseases, and bodies lying everywhere, some living, many dead. One survivor heard faint cries around the clock that she called the chant of the dead. And during this final 3-week period, the only food in the barrack was a barrel full of beet-type liquid. I would later discover that this liquid was normally fed to livestock. Because many in the barrack fought over this liquid, Bella said she would find little left in the barrel. So one night, she barely found energy to crawl out of the barrack seeking water or liquids of any kind to quench her extreme thirst. And as she crawled, her motions attracted the guard tower floodlights, and the guard shot multiple times at her. She somehow evaded the bullets and found liquids to drink. When she tried to return to the barrack in her weak and disoriented state, she found herself laying exhausted on the floor of another barrack with prisoners who had been reported to resort to cannibalism. Bella reporting having no energy to move, as one prisoner was about to cut her ear off. Incredibly, at that moment, a capo assigned to Bella's barrack found her and returned her to the barrack. Eventually, Bella, like others, became completely immobilized on their bunks and just stared as others waited to die until April 16th, the day of her liberation. As the British medical team and Red Cross faced a massive humanitarian relief operation for the 60,000 still living prisoners, time was of the essence. In their goodwill efforts to initially help those that they could, they began feeding emaciated prisoners who were still conscious, rich, solid canned food used by soldiers. As they soon learned, the shrunken intestinal tract of starving victims could not handle the rich food, and 2,000 additional prisoners unintentionally died from this intervention. Because Bella was semi-unconscious, she was unable to consume the solid foods which saved her life. And for the last time during the Holocaust, she evaded death. After the liberation, an additional 13,000 people were beyond recovery and could not be saved by humanitarian efforts at Bergen-Belsen. Bella was eventually taken to an on-site hospital, and although she physically recovered over the course of many weeks, it would take months for her to suppress the feelings of being hunted down during this period. She and other Jewish families, female survivors, acted as close surrogate family members to each other. And as the youngest of the survivors in this group, the other women, in their own way, became especially protective and supportive of Bella's recovery. Certainly, telling Bella's story is important to never forget the enormity of such human devastation. But the never again may have less significance to my grandchildren, because we know at least 15 other genocides have already taken massive number of lives in 1945. My ultimate goal is to leave a legacy that guides my grandchildren to prevent future genocide. I had to understand that the early seeds of extraordinary evil in ordinary people and how we can prevent such seeds from germinating. As I researched how ordinary German and Polish citizens were able to administer such evil acts against my mother, I discovered there are warning signs for us all. There are long-standing biases and prejudices that can be hiding in all of us in our surrounding culture. Just as anti-Semitism was deeply embedded into thousands of years of tradition in Europe, we must all be aware of and learn to fight against our potential to espouse biases and prejudices we may never even recognize we hold. I have come to the uncomfortable realization that even though I can still be a victim of anti-Semitism, I also have the potential to hold biases that victimize others. In the 1930s, the Nazi Party capitalized on biases to progressively portray Jews victims as the other and increasingly less human. We must recognize that at all times, there are opportunities to think of people as the other. If at any point we find ourselves desensitized to the suffering of human beings, we must ask ourselves if the othering has gone too far. Are we just justifying inhumane treatment of other human beings? When we are faced with difficult economic or social circumstances, we are often eager to look for simple and expedient solutions to problems that are often complex and require patience. Unless we are cognizant of this tendency, we can open door for leaders to seduce us in thinking there are simple solutions or people who are the source of and solutions to our problem. Bella's traumas never truly ended as she relived the experiences repeatedly as nightmares. Her separation from her beloved parents and siblings during her formative years left a void that was never filled the rest of her life. Nevertheless, Bella married within 2 years of her liberation, had 2 sons within 7 years. She went on to know many moments of happiness, including the joy of 3 granddaughters, 4 great-grandchildren, 2 wonderful and supportive daughter-in-laws. Bella, my mother, passed away in 2018 at the age of 90. Throughout her life, she continued to display numerous moments of courage that had become a survival instinct. But her most singular, courageous act after her liberation might have been her willingness to continue to live. And that is in conclusion of my presentation.